responded to a Twitter of Faneuil's at one point that said, "What would you do with $100 if you could right now have $100?" And I responded, and I think Faneuil was somewhat surprised that I had answers to a lot of his questions as to like, why, what are you doing to really make sure that what you're doing is working and all these sorts of things. And so that was it start of a great relationship there. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brain Explorers program that I've developed along with some colleagues at Western Michigan School of Medicine. And really, as Faneuil suggested, this idea of getting scholarship out of our outreach. And so scholarship from outreach, water from a stone or a sponge is the name of my talk. A lot of times we think of this outreach things as something that we're doing that's extra. And it's definitely how it's viewed in academia in many places. And I would argue that there's a lot of scholarship opportunities that are there through the outreach that we're doing. So a little bit about Brain Explorers. It's our mission to provide exciting and engaging, and I've bolded accessible and accessible as kind of our two emphasis points, science engagement for underserved and underrepresented populations. And really the problems that we're trying to address are a need to provide better science opportunities for underrepresented and underserved populations in science, and also this idea of decreasing trust in and access to science within the general public. And those to me fit well under this idea of accessible. Is the science accessible to people? And then also trying to address this idea of accessible. And that really stems from this fact that there's really a lack of studies demonstrating what effective science outreach really looks like and what it is. And not that it's not happening, but there's not a lot of studies out there that are saying like this works, this doesn't. And so we're trying to address that to some extent as well. The way we're going about this is through our Brain Explorers program. And so we've been teaming with local schools as well as our Pathways programs, which are basically programs designed to maintain and keep students interested in sciences, and particularly at the med school, trying to get them into healthcare or health-related fields. And we've done that by creating and assessing our neuroscience outreach. Both Dr. Porter Stransky and I are neuroscientists by training, and so that's where our interests lie, and that's the only reason this is through the neuroscience lens, not anything to do with neuroscience being a more important topic for students to be learning or anything like that. So here's some pictures of us pre-pandemic, mid-pandemic, and late pandemic, the way that things have been here in Southwest Michigan anyway. So pre-pandemic, we're all hanging out playing with sheep brains and things like that. Mid-pandemic, we transitioned to online, remote events where we basically had students working through cases and things like that, trying to understand neuroscience concepts that way. And then late pandemic, we started to be able to come back, but they only let one person of our group come and join them. And then the teacher was there and the students were in person. I know that's different than many places on either sides of the United States, but here in the Midwest, they're letting us do a little bit more. So that's been really nice. Some of the data that we've published already has to do with this kind of accessible part. And one of the questions that Andy Gall and I had, but this was actually back when I was at Hope College, not at Western Michigan, was really understanding who are we reaching when we're doing our outreach. So a lot of times I've been involved in science outreach activities where we say, hey, like we're gonna have a community day and we're gonna invite the community to come to our school and check out what we do. And I think that those are really valuable. Don't get me wrong. I think that those open house style events are very, very valuable in terms of continuing to engage people who are already interested in science. But I think when oftentimes we state that the goal of our outreach programs is to reach people who aren't interested in science or don't trust science or these sorts of things or don't have access to science. And I think those are the people that often we say we want to reach. If we look at this, when we look at just the demographic breakdown of who we're actually reaching, when we say open house participants, we were getting 71% white or Caucasian participants, and these were only measuring the middle school students that attended those events, because we went to school visits, and you can see that that number dropped significantly down to about 45%. In Holland, Zeeland area where I live, our Hispanic, Latino, Latinx community is roughly 45%. And so we were not really seeing anything close to representative of that with our open house participant. But we see closer to that with our school visit participants. So again, not surprising that we're reaching a more diverse group of people, but no one had ever published something like this before. So this actually we published in the European Journal of Neuroscience. So again, encourage you guys to really think about what you're doing and has it been done, and can I actually quantify this and publish it? Because I think for many of you, especially some of our junior residents who are still in grad school and doing other things, like this is a stepping stone and can further your career while also helping other people. This comes towards these science attitudes. And so again, not just demographically in terms of race or ethnicity, but also just in terms of overall interest in science. We're reaching people who are less interested, have lower science attitude scores when we do our in-school participants than our open house participants. And again, this isn't shocking to anybody. You would expect people who show up to a science open house to be people who want to be there and want to be engaging in science. But I think if our goal is to be reaching those who are less interested, schools where we have a captive audience is a better platform. On these other two graphs, there was no major difference between male and female in terms of these things. And this last graph really just highlights the fact that we don't have enough diverse participants at our open house event to really make any statistical claims from that. So really highlighting that we're not reaching as diverse an audience either in science attitudes or demographic. So the other side of this was kind of this accessible part. And so this is just one example of what we're doing. So we had one lesson where we had a slideshow for a very short number of slides showing kind of the lobes of the brain and what their functions were, and kind of walking students through that, having them work through some worksheets and kind of writing some stuff down. And then we had 3 hands-on activities, an active learning, learning and memory activity, as well as a sensory processing and a sheep brain dissection to kind of reinforce some of these things. We had them take 2 assessments or surveys, one before we showed up and one after. So we had an attitudes towards science survey and 2 free response questions. That was what they had to answer. And again, they took it before we showed up ever, and then they took it 2 weeks after we left. We had one of those free response questions very tied to the content that we presented. Sorry about that. And then one that was not so much directly discussed, but somewhat related. Investigators were blind as to what the responses were. So this is the Science Attitude Survey. It's a survey that's been validated. So if anybody wants to use this survey, this is another thing. If you haven't done a lot of social sciences, validated surveys are particularly important. When you're publishing things, people want to see validated surveys. If you're interested in this, let me know, and we can get the full survey to you, or you can use just the smaller part that we've been using. But these are the questions that they've been asked. And then these are the content questions. What part of your body is important for making new memories? Be as specific as possible. Now I should have pulled some out to kind of show you the difference between pre and post. But if there was no answer or it was an irrelevant answer, they got a 0. And if they started talking about, multiple brain regions being involved and working through memory consolidation, they would get a 5, which I don't know that we got any 5s from our middle schoolers, but we had to put it out there as a possibility. And then the question that was more of a control had more to do with reflexes, which we didn't really talk about in this particular lesson. with these students. When a person touches a hot iron, describe what causes the person to move their hand away. We do have some lessons where we use this, so this would then swap with the other, with this being the kind of content question. I'm sorry, my slides keep it pre-advancing on their own. But so we can swap them out and without having to make major adjustments to our assessment. Ultimately, what we showed here was that, you know, the stuff that we covered was well received, and we saw significant improvements, and the things that weren't, we didn't really see significant improvements. And this isn't, again, no one in this room is going to be like, oh my gosh, this is mind-blowing. It's not at all mind-blowing. It's exactly what you would expect to see, but it's assessing your own outreach. And if we don't see this, as I can certainly point to some cases where that wasn't the case, we can say, oh, we didn't do that quite as well as we thought we did, or how can we do this better? So it's always really important to be assessing your own work. And in doing so, it's sometimes possible to also publish that work. So what are we doing right now? One of the big things that Brain Explorers is working towards right now is creating kind of template lesson plans for the lessons that we've been putting together. And this is just an example of that template. And then basically I give this to our med students when they've created a lesson, and they have to fill these out and fill in all the different blanks and everything else. And the ultimate goal is to be able to put these on a website as a repository for people who either want to do outreach, or for educators who want to do some sort of a lesson but don't want to have to put all the time and effort into figuring all the things out. And one of the really important parts there is this preparation resources for instructors. This is where we can post YouTube videos that they can watch to kind of brush up on content and other things, or articles that might be useful, that are really helpful for the instructor themselves as they get ready to do this class. And I would say another really important piece of this that is often missing in outreach is kind of this phenomenon and driving question, as well as learning objectives. What's the purpose of the event that you're putting together? What is it that students are supposed to learn by the end of it? And a lot of times we go out and do outreach with this idea of like, isn't this going to be exciting and fun? And that's not a bad thing. That can be an objective, is that students get more engaged in science, but it's not really the lesson objective. It's the lesson of the program overall, but it's not like a lesson objective. Every lesson should still have kind of a goal for what the students are getting out of it. And then the phenomenon or driving question, this is very much a K-12 education mindset of things, but like, what's going to be that thing that catches them? So if you're going to talk about the brain and how it works, we used stroke as an example, and we show a video of a person who's in the middle of having a stroke. It's very engaging and kind of grabs them. And then you start talking about like, what the heck is going on in the brain? So what is it that can drive that student inquiry? And then having a timeline so that people can kind of walk through what is it that I'm supposed to do when, and it's adaptable, but at least there's something there for them to use without having to put a lot of extra thought and effort into creating the lesson. So I think I'm probably over time already. So the future directions is to host these lesson plans on a website for others to use. And so we're in the process of putting that together now with WMed, where I work. So they're on board with us doing it and hosting it there. I'd like to have roughly 10 lessons completely put together and maybe even tested before we actually launch the website. So there's a reasonable amount of content for people to pull from. And then using those lessons plans to kind of create pathways or longitudinal sets of lessons that teachers could be using as well. And then another thing that we are doing is evaluating the effects of this outreach on the medical students who are doing it, and continuing to assess our outreach ourselves. And we would love to grow by recruiting people to be part of Brain Explorers and doing stuff elsewhere. So if that's something that's engaging or interesting to you, definitely let me know. Real briefly, what we see with our student instructor impact is that they feel like it's helping them to explain concepts to non-scientists. It's helping them just in general being interested in communicating with non-scientists about science. and that their communication skills are improving. Some quotes from our medical students. As medical student, it's beneficial to be teaching and explaining the topic, because it can be difficult to explain things, but I also think it helps me as a medical student better learn the content when I teach it. So that's a benefit to them specifically, just in terms of how well do I know this stuff. But then also things like, I'm going to have to be able to teach my future patients, and learning how to communicate science at a lower level than what I'm learning it at is actually really valuable to these people. So again, thinking about who might be actually affected by the outreach that you're doing, and it's not always just the people with whom to whom you're reaching out. So I think that's another way that people can use their outreach to consider scholarship. And I'll leave you with this, which is just to encourage you to really consider how your outreach can be translated into scholarship that helps others do what you do, but also helps you advance your career. I think especially when people are doing outreach, there's this sense that like, it shouldn't be about me. It shouldn't be for me. It should only be for the people to whom I'm trying to reach out. And I would encourage you to consider that it's completely okay for it to be a very altruistic endeavor for other people, but that you can also get something out of it for yourself, and that there's nothing wrong with that. So I would encourage you to consider how your outreach can be translated into scholarship.